Let me tell you something that the mainstream media will not say out loud. Something that the think tanks in Washington are whispering behind closed doors but are too afraid to publish. Something that every serious geopolitical analyst already knows but dresses up in comfortable language so it does not sound as catastrophic as it actually is. The United States of America, the most powerful empire in the history of human civilization, is not declining. It has already declined. The question is not whether American global dominance is ending. That conversation is over. The only question that matters now, the question that will define the lives of every single person on this planet between now and 2027, is what fills that void. And the answer, when you look at the actual data, when you read the actual documents, when you trace the actual money, is not hopeful. It is not reassuring. It is, by any honest measure, terrifying. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not panic. Sit with it, because panic is what the powerful want. Panic makes people run toward false safety. What I am asking you to do is something harder. I am asking you to think clearly in a moment of civilizational transition, because that is what this is. This is not a political cycle. This is not a recession. This is not a trade war that gets resolved at a summit table with handshakes and press releases. This is the end of a unipolar world order that has governed human life since 1991. And what emerges from its collapse will not look like anything in your political textbook. Here is where we begin. American power was never just military. That is the first mistake people make when they talk about this. They see aircraft carriers and they think that is the source of American dominance. The carriers are a symptom, not a cause. American power was built on three interlocking pillars: the dollar as the global reserve currency, the narrative monopoly that allowed America to define what was legitimate and what was not on the world stage, and the network of alliances and institutions that translated both into enforceable reality. Destroy any one of those three pillars and the whole structure weakens. Right now, in real time, all three are fracturing simultaneously. That has never happened before in the post-war era. Never. The dollar is being quietly abandoned not by adversaries, but by partners. Saudi Arabia began pricing oil transactions in yuan. Brazil and China signed a bilateral trade agreement that bypasses the dollar entirely. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. The BRICS nations are not just talking about an alternative reserve currency. They are building the infrastructure for one. This is not anti-American rhetoric. This is accounting. When the dollar loses its reserve status, America loses the ability to print money and export inflation to the rest of the world. When that happens, the cost of American empire, the bases, the carriers, the foreign aid that is actually foreign leverage, becomes something American taxpayers pay for directly. And when American taxpayers see that bill clearly for the first time, the domestic political consequences will be seismic. But the dollar story is actually the slow story. The fast story, the one moving at a speed that most analysts are not tracking correctly, is the narrative collapse. For 70 years, America controlled the story, not just through Hollywood and CNN, but through the institutional architecture of how global legitimacy was constructed. The United Nations Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the International Criminal Court when it was convenient. These were not neutral international bodies. They were, in practice, instruments of American norm setting. And the rest of the world largely accepted this because American power was real enough to make acceptance rational. That contract is broken. It did not break because of one policy or one president. It broke because of accumulation. Accumulation of contradiction between what America said and what America did. Contradiction that became impossible to ignore when social media gave the global South a mirror and a megaphone simultaneously. When the world watched and said nothing and did nothing while people died in Gaza, something shifted permanently in the moral authority calculation. When the world watched America sanction countries that disagreed with it, freeze sovereign assets as a weapon, exclude nations from SWIFT as punishment, the message that landed in Beijing, in Delhi, in Riyadh, in Jakarta, in Nairobi was not "America is strong." The message was, we need a system where America cannot do this to us. And they are building it, quietly, methodically, with a patience that American political culture, which operates on 2-year election cycles, is structurally incapable of matching. Now we come to 2027. Why 2027 specifically? Because that is when several of these structural shifts reach operational maturity at the same time. China's military modernization timeline, which is not a secret, it is published in their own defense white papers, targets 2027 as the year the People's Liberation Army completes the transformation into what Beijing calls a world-class military. That is the year their aircraft carrier fleet reaches operational parity in the Pacific. That is the year their hypersonic missile systems, which currently have no American countermeasure, reach full deployment scale. But here is what almost nobody is talking about. 2027 is also when China's domestic consumption is projected to surpass America's as the largest consumer market on Earth. When that happens, the leverage mathematics reverse. Right now, America can sanction Chinese companies, and it hurts. By 2027, sanctioning a major economy means cutting your own corporations off from the largest consumer base on the planet. The sanction weapon becomes self-destructive. American economic coercion, the most powerful non-military tool in Washington's toolkit, goes from a weapon into a liability. But wait, I said what replaces American power is terrifying. I want to be precise about why, because the terrifying part is not what you might expect. It is not that China takes over and runs a Chinese-style world order. The terrifying scenario is not a clean replacement. The terrifying scenario is the gap, the period between the old order losing its ability to enforce stability and the new order gaining the legitimacy and capacity to provide it. That gap, and based on current trajectories, that gap is when everything dangerous happens. This is when regional powers that were previously deterred by American credibility start making moves they previously couldn't. This is when the rules-based international order, which for all its hypocrisy at least provided a framework for managing great power conflict, becomes genuinely optional. This is when small miscalculations become large wars because there is no credible arbiter. Think about what is already happening right now as a preview. Taiwan is not a future problem. It is a present pressure point where the gap between American commitment and American capability is already visible to decision makers in Beijing. The South China Sea is not a future flashpoint. The cartographic reality there has already been changed by Chinese infrastructure in ways that American naval presence has not reversed and will not reverse. North Korea is not constrained by American deterrence the way it was in 2005. Iran is not behaving like a country afraid of American power. Russia calculated, correctly as it turned out, that the actual military response to invading Ukraine would stop at the borders of NATO. These are not isolated events. They are data points in a pattern, and the pattern is the same pattern. The cost-benefit calculation of defying American preferences has changed, and every regional actor on Earth is updating their models accordingly. Here is the part that should disturb you most. The institutions that were supposed to manage this kind of transition, the United Nations, the G20, the IMF, were designed for a world where one power had the legitimacy and capacity to enforce their decisions. They were never designed for genuine multipolarity. There is no institutional architecture for a world where 4 or 5 major powers have roughly equivalent destructive capability and fundamentally incompatible visions of what global order should look like. The United States believes in liberal democratic norms as the universal organizing principle. China believes in civilizational sovereignty and non-interference. Russia believes in spheres of influence defined by historical and cultural connection. India believes in strategic autonomy and will not be organized into anyone's alliance system. These are not differences that get resolved at a diplomatic table. These are civilizational disagreements about the fundamental nature of legitimate governance. And there is no referee. What does this mean for ordinary people? Not geopoliticians, not generals, not central bankers, ordinary people going about their lives. It means supply chains that were optimized for a stable American-led order will not be stable. It means the food and energy price shocks of the early 2020s were not anomalies. They were previews. It means the technology systems that run daily life, the cloud infrastructure, the semiconductor supply chains, the undersea cables that carry 95% of global internet traffic are now active theaters of strategic competition. It means that the travel, the trade, the financial transactions, the social media connections that make the modern world feel like a single interconnected place are increasingly running on infrastructure that great powers are actively working to fragment, surveil, and control. Deglobalization is not an economic theory anymore. It is a construction project, and it is ahead of schedule. I am not telling you this to paralyze you. I am telling you this because the first step to navigating a dangerous transition is refusing to pretend it is not happening. The political class in the West, with exceptions, is still operating in the language of restoration. Get back to normal, rebuild alliances, reassert leadership. That is not a strategy. That is nostalgia dressed as policy. The world that is coming does not have an undo button. The unipolar moment is not pausing, it is ending. The question for every institution, every economy, every society is not how do we restore what was. The question is, how do we build something viable inside what is actually coming? The most dangerous people in this moment are not the ones who see the danger clearly. The most dangerous people are the ones in positions of power who know the old order is over, but keep performing confidence in it because the alternative, admitting publicly that the architecture of the last 70 years is collapsing, feels too destabilizing to say. But silence in the face of a structural shift of this magnitude is not responsible leadership. It is a choice to let people be blindsided by something that was entirely foreseeable. And history does not forgive the leaders who had the information, had the platform, had the moment, and chose the comfort of the familiar story over the courage of the true one. The end of American global power has begun. What replaces it by 2027 is not one thing. It is not China. It is not a new multilateral utopia. It is a more dangerous, more fragmented, more contested world than anything living memory contains. And the people who will shape whether that world becomes survivable or catastrophic are not waiting for permission to act, which means neither should you.